So let's begin with the very interesting story of the three chiefs from Bechuanaland who visited Britain. So on the 7th of September 1895, the 4:30 p.m. train from Plymouth pulled into Paddington Station, carrying with it three unusual passengers. The crowds and press flocked to the platform to catch a glimpse of these exotic curiosities come to the heart of empire. The visitors were three kings from the British Protectorate of Bechuanaland, which is modern-day Botswana. They were Sebele I of the Bechuana, Bathwin I of the Ngwatsi, and Khama III of the Bangwato. Over the next 3 months, the chiefs will conduct what Black historian David Olusoga has described as one of the best organised and most effective public relation operations in history. So why did the chiefs come to Britain? Well, in 1885, the British in South Africa, or the Cape Colony as it was called then, declared the native territory of Bechuanaland, which you can see in the centre of the map, a protectorate to stop the Dutch Boer settlers from the Republic of the Transvaal and the Germans from German Southwest Africa, which is modern-day Namibia, colonising the land above the Cape, which would have cut off the colony from the British possessions in the north. So this was short of full-scale annexation, and a protectorate remained under the control of local and native rulers, but under the supervision and suzerainty of the British Crown. So this is a kind of form of empire on the cheap, where the British technically own the land, but they don't pay for it. However, within a few years, the discovery of diamonds and gold deposits across southern Africa led to what was called the Kaffir boom. Shares in concessionary companies skyrocketed, leading to a boom in territorial expansion. Concessionary companies were companies that both extracted the products of a territory, either food or minerals, but also administered to it politically. So another form of empire on the cheap. It's not the government that own it, it's the company. The largest of these companies by far was the notorious British South Africa Company, which was owned and directed by perhaps the most diabolical and recently controversial figure in British history, Cecil Rhodes. Between 1888 and 1894, Rhodes and the company gained control over modern-day Zambia and Zimbabwe, which they named North and South Rhodesia after Rhodes. And Rhodes had continually pressed the Colonial Office for permission to annex Bechuanaland in order to complete his pet project, the Cape to Cairo Railway. This was a rail that would have connected Egypt to the Cape, so it would have covered the entire length of Britain's African territories. So it's a great calling card, bigger kind of thing. So in early 1895, a charter by the government was granted, giving Rhodes control over British Bechuanaland, which was the southern part of Bechuana, and it was perceived to be only a matter of time before the Northern Protectorate would be absorbed too. So the three paramount chiefs were not happy at the prospect of their land becoming another plot in Rhodes' business empire. As Christians, all of them reformed teetotalers, monogamous, and committed to spreading Christianity in their kingdoms, the chiefs had strong connections with British missionary organisations, especially the largest of them, the London Missionary Society. This key ally proved a bridge to Britain through which they could successfully organise a visit to Britain to seek Queen Victoria and the Colonial Office's assistance in stopping Rhodes's annexation. But whilst those like Rhodes and British administrators within Africa repeatedly encountered native black people, back in Britain it was an entirely different story. Whilst there were small black communities in East London and Bristol, these were absolutely minute. Indeed, almost no British person in 1895 could say they'd even ever seen a black person. Instead, the public relied upon the imagined images of Africans provided in books, exhibitions and popular culture. These were naturally warped by social Darwinist ideas of racial superiority, which had become commonplace within popular culture and social sphere. Public exhibitions like the great Farini's ethnographic displays at the London Aquarium would overemphasise the simian features and backward tribal ways of native Africans. Romantic novels and music hall shows would have the innocent white woman captured and lusted after by the animalistic and cannibal savages before the humble missionary or noble soldier rescued them. You know, even commercial advertising, it was around this time the Gollywog appeared, would emphasise the inferiority and blackness of Britain's African subjects. So thus, within Britain, the African was presented and imagined purely through race, a vastly inferior race, thousands of years behind Britain and likely doomed to extinction. As such, upon hearing the imminent arrival of the chiefs from Bechuanaland, the Edinburgh Evening News believed King Khama would appear something like this. So here he is, he's got his big fat lips, scary, rabid eyes, the earring, the draped down robes, the woolly hair. This is the imagined African, the savage, the complete ethnographic specimen. So it's little wonder then that the first encounters and accounts of the chiefs when they arrived utilised racial and ethnographic language and stereotypes. In its account of their arrival at Paddington, the St James Gazette stated how Bathwin had, quote, the flat springy nose, large open eyes and heavy lips of a true child of Ham. Sibile's cast of face meant he could easily have posed as a barrister, quote, if it were not for his dark copper hue, whilst Karma was, quote, of a singular though negroid type with woolly hair. The Illustrated London News commented on Sibile's muscular type of figure and Karma's stooping shoulders, whilst also expressing disappointment at their choice of European dress, which it felt rather hurt, quote, the picturesqueness of the group. Indeed, many seem to be hoping for a real-life version of the Africans they'd seen in the theatre, with the spears and the loincloths, etc. But it didn't take long for the regal manners and clothing of the chiefs to get Britons questioning this representation. The East Anglian Daily Times admitted how, quote, attired in well-fitting morning dress, the chiefs might easily pass for European gentlemen if it were not for their swarthy hue. Indeed, in the initial stage of their visit, the chiefs couldn't escape the prejudices and stereotypes the British were accustomed to, however much their dress and manners impressed them. As the Liverpool Mercury said, Karma was, quote, like a king, though only an Africa king. After a few weeks and failed discussions with the British South Africa Company at the Colonial Office in London, the chiefs decided to take their campaign on the road, journeying to the localities and northern industrial cities. Over 5 weeks they visited, I'm going to need a big breath here, Brighton, Bristol, Reading, Wellingborough, Enderby, Leicester, Birmingham, Stockport, Liverpool, Bradford, Leeds, Ipswich, Manchester, Edinburgh and Glasgow. Crucially, unlike London, where imperial matters were well discussed and understood, the localities had far less than imperial experience and rarely encountered British royalty, let alone the exotic royalty of empire. As such, the chiefs encountered a far different reception. In Birmingham, the chiefs were treated to a breakfast banquet at the town hall with the alderman and the Bishop of Coventry, an open carriage tour of the city, and a visit to Cadbury's and other factories. Birmingham newspapers always addressed the chiefs as kings and their highnesses, and were actually, quote, grievously disappointed at the lack of regal pomp at the chiefs' arrival at the station. In Liverpool, the chiefs attended a civic luncheon at the town hall with the corporation and Lord Mayor, before visiting the transatlantic Cunard liner the Campania, where 2 trumpeters sounded a royal salute as they boarded. A full turnout of crew met them on board before they were given a royal tour by the captain. By the time the chiefs had reached Edinburgh at the end of October, they were virtually royalty. Arriving by open-top carriages along the Royal Mile, the chiefs were greeted at the city chambers with a red carpet, ceremonial sword bearers and a military band before taking tea with the mayor and local nobility. Everywhere they visited, the chiefs dazzled the British with their decorum, regal manners and European dress. Indeed, the Birmingham Post illustrated how, quote, a Bechuana chief would never so far forget his dignity as to betray any vulgar emotion. These were Africans who could take tea with mayors, dine with barons and ladies, and who never forgot their royal status. In fact, there's a story that in Liverpool, Karma refused to sit in the back of a carriage, stating, I am the king and the king goes first, before sitting in the front driver's seat. Karma, always overshadowing his fellow chiefs, even had his portrait painted on special edition Staffordshire pottery. Meanwhile, the reputation of Rhodes, who was once the hero of British imperialism in Africa, and the British South Africa Company had crashed. Rhodes was now the Pooh Bah of Africa to the Times, whilst liberal newspapers like the Manchester Guardian revealed Rhodes's ill treatment of African natives and his backhanded dealings with the government. Within a month of arriving, the chiefs had completely reversed perceptions of themselves and Rhodes. They were now the stars of empire, whilst Rhodes was the bloodthirsty savage. Upon returning to London in November, the chiefs were the Duke of Westminster's guests of honour at a breakfast banquet at Grosvenor House, attended by the elite of London society. On the 5th of November, the chiefs attended their final meeting at the Colonial Office with Colonial Secretary Joseph Chamberlain and the British South Africa Company officials. Unlike before, they now had the support and respect of much of the British public, and Chamberlain's hands were very much tied. It was decided that only a small area of each of their kingdoms, 6 miles wide, would be clipped for Rhodes's railway, but otherwise the protectorate would remain under Crown authority, and the chiefs would, quote, rule their own people as much as present. The Chiefs had accomplished what 2 months before was seen as impossible. 3 Africans had stopped the seemingly relentless expansion of Rhodes and the British South Africa Company. Obviously, their long stay and displays of civilization and Christianity had won over the British into somewhat abandoning notions of racial hierarchy and stereotype. But crucially, it was these displays of, quote, civilization, westernization and Christianity that had led to the Chiefs' acceptance, popularity and eventual success in Britain. Foremost, the Bechuana Chiefs and the British shared a religion whose spread was seen as a primary role of colonialism and the civilizing mission. Even the Illustrated London News admitted that Khama's westernising reforms in Christianity were, quote, resolve in which he sustained by public opinion in England. For many, more than their African race or royal class, their religious identity and zeal defined the Chiefs. In his feature, the journalist W.T. Stead used biblical simile in describing how Khama was like Clovis, the medieval king who King Cebele was more famous for his baptism and education by the Scottish missionary David Livingstone than by his own merit or royal position. It was often the only thing many interviewers found worthy to ask him about. This religious notoriety and identity was flaunted by the Chiefs, who soon realised its significance. They visited St Paul's, they paid homage at Livingstone's tomb in Westminster Abbey, and were sure to publicly attend church every Sunday. And a key factor in manufacturing this religious identity was the London Missionary Society, which had organised much of their visit. 1895 also marked the Society's centenary, and the Chiefs attended over 20 centenary celebrations all over Britain. At these centenary events, and others like them in the localities, and even at the Grosvenor House breakfast, the Chiefs appeared the perfect beneficiaries of the Empire's civilising mission, with their Christianity, Western reforms and European dress, rather than as kings. Indeed, at one society meeting at the City Temple, London, the Chiefs were introduced as, quote, the fruits of the labours of the missionaries, whilst the Yorkshire Daily Post called them, quote, the best example of what a black man can become by means of good disposition and Christianity. The Chiefs left Britain on the 21st of November, having achieved their aims at stemming the British South Africa Company's expansion. Whilst their status as kings had somewhat been acknowledged, it was their reforming and Christian characters that had won over the British and trumped their racial identity. As one MP stated, the Chiefs had been recognised as Christian gentlemen everywhere in Britain. They were encountered far more as examples of the Empire's civilising mission than respected as sovereign rulers, even in their royal reception from the localities. They were edifices to what Africans could be, the sum of a century of missionary and imperial endeavour, rather than the representatives of Africa itself. Nonetheless, the Chiefs had importantly questioned British views towards their African subjects. Indeed, whereas the imagined King Khama before the visit in the Edinburgh Evening Post looked like this, following the visit, the fierce savage with bared teeth and wild eyes had turned into this, a respectable black citizen full of the graces that the British Empire could provide. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you.
Thank you.
So sorry we couldn't see Josh throughout it. We've been having some problems. But if you do have any questions, we'll stick around for about 30 seconds to see if any questions come through, just because there's a bit of a delay. But there's a little live Q&A section. You can just comment in. I'm happy to answer any questions as long as Josh's laptop isn't. Yeah.
I'm here.
We'll wait and see if there's any questions. There is a bit of a delay, so we will see.
Could they not see the PowerPoint?
Yeah.
Oh, good. That's all right then.
Just couldn't see you. But PowerPoint was the important part. Don't worry.
Good. It was so good. There's no questions.
I was going to ask you a question to keep you busy, but okay.
Okay, now you can ask me a question, go for it.
Now I was going to say, what made you choose that topic?
Well, I remember first reading about the Chiefs in a fantastic book by David Olusoga called Black and British, that uncovered like the forgotten black chapters in British history, and then, you know, that was a couple of years ago, and what I'm researching at the minute for my dissertation is visits like this of African and Indian royalty to Britain to see how they were treated. Were they seen as, you know, the inferior racial minorities of the empire, or were they respected as the kings, you know, equal to those of the European monarchs and emperors? So yeah, and I think especially what's happening at the minute with the whole Cecil Rhodes, and I think it's really important that people really open their eyes to Black British history, and I think this is an enormous piece of history that people don't know, and they really should, because it's so interesting.
100%. Okay, well, I don't think we have any questions. If we do, we can pick it up. Oh, literally just then, as I say it. So I'm sorry if I say this wrong, Tarini says, how do you feel these representations of the chiefs has impacted the way the media portrays people of colour in the modern world?
This is the really sad thing, that the Chiefs, by the time that they had finished their tour and got what they wanted, they were no longer sort of seen as representatives of Africa. They were seen as representatives of what Africa could be. You know, it's not this, it didn't bring about the sense of, oh, you know, the people that we're ruling over are actually all right. If anything, it fostered more of a passion to carry on with the empire mission. It's like, oh, well, if this is how we can get the kings to turn out, if we stay a little bit longer, we can get everyone to turn it out to be. So if anything like that, and unfortunately, you know, as their history has been forgotten, it's kind of not helped at all. But I think if we did have more stories about this coming out, more books, more education on this particular chapter in British history, I think it would impact it all over, because I think even now when we learn about empire in schools and in documentaries, it still carries on that imperial notion of the British were trying to help the inferior Africans and Indians, where in fact, as we've seen now, a lot of the time it was the other way around. You know, the Bechuana Chiefs were actually depended upon to rule that country by the British. The British depended upon them.
Lovely. I think that's it now. It's always, as I say, we have no questions, but a question appears.
Yes.
If any more do come through, just because there is that little delay, we can always pick it up after and get the response to people. But thank you so much, Josh. It was really nice to bring your research to the symposium. It's been very different to all the different research has been presented this week. And thank you to everyone who has been tuning in. We have 2 more presentations tomorrow, one at 1 and one at 3. So make sure you tune in, and see you later.
Thank you.
Welcome back. I'm really sorry. A question came through just as we ended it. Inevitable, because it's a really annoying delay. But I have Josh back, and I will ask this question. It was from Alex, who, if I'm correct, was an alumni member of history, maybe. Yeah, perfect. So the question is, was being Christian more important in creating this idea that people from Africa could become civilized, or was it more the fact that they were seen as British subjects?
I think because technically all people in the empire were seen as British subjects, that didn't stop them being criminalized and demonized and animalized and even fetishized and stuff like that. You know, so you have, you know, the beautiful naked
black woman, and, you know, who would always be inferior to the white woman, despite the fact that they're both subject to them. I think Christianity was the key, and it was a thing that was that these were rulers who almost wanted to be what the British wanted them to be. They wanted to have Western reforms. They wanted to be Christian and spread Christianity. They were loved by, you know, the godly middle class for trying to stop the sale of alcohol. And often the times that was the thing that people thought they'd come over to Britain for. If you read certain missionary magazines and even newspapers, they say they've come over here to try and ask for the government's help to stop the import of strong liquor into their company, when that's not the reason they come here at all. But that was all, you know, it was always mixed messages, because they had so many viewpoints. You could look at them as these, you know, these Christian men who were just trying to do the best thing for their people, or you could say these are downtrodden people who were trying to stop the annexation of their land by an absolute idiot who just wants to kill people and build railways and mine gold. Like,
Lovely. And did you say you had a question? Someone asked.
I do have this from Rory Bathgate, and he asked me, do you think institutes such as the British film industry should play more of an active role in funding film and television projects to cover historical studies such as this, particularly in regards to giving Black British filmmakers a voice? I think absolutely. Because this is just one time that that African rulers came over, and in the period I'm studying for my dissertation alone, so 1882 to 1937, that's only 55 years, you had King Bechuana of the Zulu, who was so far only been filmed as the savage in the animal skin with the spear trying to fight Michael Caine in Zulu. You have the Bechuana Chiefs. You then have King Lewanika of Borochiland, who came in 1902 and went to Edward VII's coronation and was perfectly well respected as an equal member. That's never been covered before. You had Swazi delegations in 1907, 1909 and 1919. You had King Yetta III of Borochiland come, and he fought really, really hard against the colonial government to be invited to George VI's coronation in 1937, and he eventually got there by going over the top and asking the king himself, and the king said, yeah, sure, come along. So it's these fantastic stories about these people who are going, no, we are going to go there, and we will show you and how we're not these inferior citizens that you say we are, but it's not. And it's that, and that's the problem with imperial history. Either they don't teach it at all, or they do the classic tale of, we were bad, we took these from these poor people, but that's still continuing the myth that British top, African Indian bottom, we were just treading down on them more. And that was the case, but that's still maintaining the fact that they are inferior, which, you know, as stories like this show, are completely not true at all.
Do you think that, like with everything going on with the Black Lives Matter movement, that actually people are ashamed in our history and like acknowledging white privilege or acknowledging anything that, you know, people before them could have done that could reflect on themselves or our history, and that actually one of the reasons that it's not being taught is just that they don't want to put their hands up and say we've done wrong?
Absolutely, absolutely true. I mean, I had, I think, 10 weeks of what you would call learning about the British Empire in secondary school in year 9. And we just talked a little bit about the slavery, and then, you know, like the elephants in India and just stuff like that. And that's not an education. And in this country, we only cover the bits that we're proud of. So you start off in year 7, it goes Romans, Saxons, Normans, medieval times, Henry VIII, Armada, miss the 300 years of colonialism, Victorians, the 2 world wars that we won, the good bits, when in fact there's an enormous 200 years where we systematically conquered and downtrod 2/5 of the world population and 1/4 of the world's surface, plundering it, taking its land, taking its profits, holding back the development of these people who would likely have gone on, and they would be first world countries now. When Britain and France first went to India in the 1600s, India was the biggest economy in the world and the richest. And yet 1947, when we leave, it's one of the poorest, because we kept it at that level in the 1600s so we could continue it. And if kids learn about that, maybe it will help them to understand why these things are in such a problem. But at the minute, because they're not, it's maintaining that Victorian thing of India and Africa. They're so war-torn, they're so, downtrodden, they're so poor, because it's their fault, just simply because they're a third world country, when in fact it's because of us and Europe and European colonialism that they are third world countries.
100%. So what would you do to change it? Because obviously as a SAB we look at how we can change things at university, and you've spoken about obviously how you would change the education system from a younger age. But is there anything else you think needs to be done? Obviously we touched upon media earlier, but the larger scale of actually let's turn this around.
I think absolutely, and I think there's a big movement to decolonize the curriculum, and certainly decolonizing it in terms of what you teach, definitely. But strangely enough, the best thing to decolonize is to teach colonizing history and stuff like that. So make people aware of why we have what we have, which I think is why, when people are toppling statues and stuff, absolutely support that. But then they go into museums, so they're still there and they're still teaching history, but the history that needs to be taught. So when the slave owner gets pulled down in Bristol, when he's put in a museum, he's shown as, yes, he was the philanthropist who built schools and helped children, but he was also a slave trader of 80,000 slaves. So you can have the good history, but it needs to be with the bad, because that is British history. We call ourselves Great Britain, and we say we had the revolution. That was paid for on the backs of slaves who built up the money that we could afford to industrialize first. And that's what
I think we've just lost him for a second.
explain why. Why was this tiny rock on the side of Europe now coming back? Am I back?
Sorry, you broke off just after talking about
Am I back now?
Yes, you're back. You were just telling us how Great Britain was built off of the slave trade, and
absolutely.
Then you kind of went off.
Yes. Yeah, no, this, how this tiny rock off the edge of Europe, why is it now a big player in the world? Why is it on in the G7 and G12? It's because of what we did over the world. British history can't be just about what happened here. It has to be about what we did over the world, because that is what made us who we are today. We look at these the weekend at these lovely country houses and have a look around. There needs to be plaques there saying this house was built by the 3rd Earl, who owned 15,000 slaves. If you look at any country house that was built after in this country, there's a 90% chance that was paid for by lord owning slaves, and that's just not shown. We go there and we see the pretty pictures and the nice ornaments, and and have a tea in the garden.
So I would never have known it was that high a percentage.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And it wasn't just. There's this thing that slavery had nothing to do with the working classes. David Olusoga did a fantastic thing where it was like, even what we will call everyday people could own shares in a slave. The Archbishop of Canterbury owned slaves. Vicars would own a slave that would have shares in that they would, you know. What do we teach about slavery? We teach about the abolition of slavery and payoff of all. Am I back?
Yes. Do you want to turn your camera off and just repeat what you just said? Hi. Yes. Do you want to turn your camera off maybe and see if you can repeat what you just said?
Yes. I've turned it off. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. It's not the best picture, but never mind.
I mean, I love it.
So what do we teach about the end of slavery? Is we teach about how wonderful it was that we freed all these slaves. What we don't talk about is how, in order to do that, the government had to do the biggest payout to date still it's ever done, which was with the equivalent today of £14 billion. Ooh. Who did that money go to? It didn't go to the slaves who had been enslaved for 300 years. It went to the people who owned the slaves as compensation.
Did you say as compensation?
The slaves by paying off the slave owners.
That's awful.
And yet people don't know that and respect that and acknowledge that.
Honestly, your presentation, everything you've kind of said now is even like since the Black Lives Matter movement, I feel like all of us have tried to kind of learn something and learn how we're privileged or how we've been wrong in the past. There's still even things you've told me today is just I don't think I ever would have come across.
No.
Like you've got to know the things to search, don't you? You need to know the questions to ask. Whereas that's our problem. We weren't even educated to ask the right questions.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Wow.
I would highly recommend if people want to educate themselves on this kind of thing, about British history, but proper global British history, a fantastic book to start off with is Black and British by David Olusoga, because it's an easy read and it just tells you how much we've been mistaken about British history and the presence of Black people in Britain for 1,000 years. So definitely, please, if anyone's interested, start there and then move on from there because it's fantastic.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming on here and answering the questions as well. I really appreciate it. And I will see you later.
Yes. Thank you. See you, Laura.